Thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. We'll be talking about AI and clinical implications, along with a lot of other types of topics that will come up, of course, as part of this. I am excited to present this topic. This is our second webinar on AI, and we had so many questions, so many great topics. We wanted to touch on it again after the first of the year and kind of expand, go a little bit deeper. And I'm very excited to have the panel in front of me today, in front of you as well, and I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll launch into the webinar. So first off, I want to introduce Erin Magurergi, who is Senior Counsel at Foley and Lardner, Teresa Rincon, who is Dr. Rincon, an RN, as well as a professor at the Graduate School of Nursing at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is also a Blue Cirrus consultant. Nick Patel, who is the founder of Stealth Consulting, is the CEO and founder, as well as the prior vice chair of medicine and former chief digital officer at Prisma Health. And finally, Lisa May Williams, Dr. Lisa May Williams, also an RN who is a clinical consultant for Intercept Telehealth and also a senior consultant for Blue Cirrus Consulting. So lots and lots of expertise on this webinar. So first, I want to show the audience something, and we'll do a poll right after you see this video. So hopefully you're able to see that. This will be a test of my own abilities with sharing in Zoom in the middle of a webinar and having the pressure of this. So hopefully you can see that. Yeah.
All right, testing Gemini. There we go. Tell me what you see.
I see you placing a piece of paper on the table. I see a squiggly line.
What about now?
The contour lines are smooth and flowing, with no sharp angles or jagged edges. It looks like a bird to me.
What if I add this?
The bird is swimming in the water. It has a long neck and beak. It is a duck.
Yes.
A duck is a type of waterfowl in the family Anatidae. Ducks are closely related to geese and swans. The duck appears to be blue. This is not a common color for ducks. However, there are some breeds of blue ducks. These are typically not as common as other duck breeds. It is more common for ducks to be brown, black, or white.
Are you sure?
What the quack?
So what I wanted to show you, if you may have seen this, this video of Gemini, the new Google AI tool, and it's a kind of a funny video. There's more to it there, but in the poll, I want you to tell me, when did you know that this was a duck? So I'm going to launch this poll, and you should be able to, as attendees and others, you should be able to answer the poll. And at what point did you see that it was a duck? Did you have to wait till the water was drawn? Did you see it at the feet, at contour lines? When did you notice? So we're seeing the answers coming in pretty fast and furious, and we can see that typically people are seeing it after the contour lines. Myself, I saw it after the feet were drawn. I wasn't quite sure till I saw those duck feet. But the AI didn't actually know it until that water was drawn in, but humans actually can see that it was a duck prior to AI. So there are some limitations to AI, and that's part of what we want to talk about today, and how we can, and I'll end this poll here, and how we can address them, particularly when it comes to clinical implications around artificial intelligence. And one of the important things is about explainability of AI. So I'd like to be able to discuss with the panel why explainability or interpretability of AI is so important, particularly with healthcare. And Lisa May, if you would start us off with that one, it would be great.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So explainability, interpretability, it's really to build trust in these AI models. And as healthcare providers, we need to understand why the model or the algorithm produced a result. So we're not going on blind faith in healthcare. We need to understand the why. How did they come up with the answers? The National Institute of Standards and Technology in the Department of Commerce proposed 4 principles when assessing the explainability of AI models. And so this is something that we need to understand as we're more now interfacing with AI models as we take care of patients. One is the explanation of the results and what evidence, was supporting that result. Is it meaningful? Meaning that that explanation needs to be tailored to the recipient. So is it a neurologist that needs to understand the result, or is it the nurse? Is it the pharmacist? Who is receiving that result? And the accuracy of the explanation. So, for example, you want the AI model to describe an orange, but it's giving you an explanation about fruit. So that's not quite accurate. So we need to query these models and understand the explanation accuracy and also the limits. What limitations does the model recognize? So if the model understands that there are cases that are in its data set that it's been trained on, or it's now looking at cases that are not relevant, that it's able to explain that the result is not reliable. So all of those factors, I thought, I did a lot of reading on it, and explainable AI it's very vast. You go down the rabbit hole. IBM has a really great explanation, but essentially it's for us as clinicians, as providers, to have trust in what we're seeing, so that our patients can have trust in the use of AI and taking care of them.
Absolutely makes sense to me. But Nick, I wanted to know your opinion as well, based on your experience and at Prisma. Have you come in contact with this idea of explainability versus interpretability, and how do we make sure that we're building trust with AI?
Yeah, I thank you for having me, number one. But I agree with Lisa May. I mean, a lot of it has to be building trust. It's just like, my fellow nurses and me being a physician, we went through training ourselves through medical school, residency training, fellowship training, etc. The trust me as an attending gives a first-year medical student versus a third-year resident is different. It's kind of like that Gemini AI you just showed. It's almost like you're showing a child, right, the different parts of a duck and then interpreting that as a duck and remembering that. So part of this is understanding that safety, and that so safety around, when do I use AI, when I don't use AI, and then it comes with accountability around the AI, and which again is important for building that trust. And again, from a regulatory perspective, that's also very very important. So there's a lot of components of this that we have to consider. And I think the critical role is that we have to be transparent, and that the interpretability of that is critical for the ethical and effective integration of AI technology in clinical practice, because physicians, nurses, and other folks and team members have to have that trust. So if it's based on it listening and interpreting patients' input prior to the visit, or giving suggestions or diagnoses and other things, we have to be able to trust that. And we also, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, make sure that it's not biased, and we effectively try to eliminate or reduce the hallucinations that'll come out of it. So, but key to this is trust for that patient safety side.
Yeah. And just if I could just add really quickly,
Please.
Regulators are looking into this, and some are even saying that we're going to have meaningful use for AI as it's adopted by more and more healthcare organizations. So there's a lot more to come on it, but as clinicians, the audience, just to encourage you to read more and understand as you're incorporating this into the care of your patients, that we're really held accountable to understanding the why of these results and not just accepting it at face value. AI is supposed to enhance, not replace, what we're doing as caregivers.
Really good point. And I think what I'm seeing a lot in the market is artificial intelligence marketing versus what is automation, right? And how do we distinguish between artificial intelligence and automation? And I'm gonna ask Teresa to kind of start there. And Nick, if you want to add into this after Teresa has a chance to discuss it as well.
And I think I'll build a little bit on what we've talked about, and I'm going to take a little bit of an opposite stance here, but let's first talk about automation. So automation is when we set up devices and technologies by a defined set of rules. So we're automating something, but we're telling it, we do this in robotic process automation all the time. We teach a device, tool, or robot to do something, but it's following a defined set of rules. And then it follows, and it can do things much faster than human beings can do. And it can do it with less errors, right? Because it can repeat the same thing over and over and over. It doesn't get distracted. It doesn't get tired, right? It doesn't have an emotional response that might influence decision-making. So it's able to do this. And that's why we see it in manufacturing and in other fields quite frequently. They're using these types of things. We see this, barcoding is one way. We take the barcode scanner that automatically goes into the MAR. That's all set up by predefined rules. There's no AI driving that. When we think about AI or artificial intelligence, that's when we design machines that simulate or mimic human cognition and decision-making. So we are taking something and having it like we saw in that, fairly rudimentary example, because we have seen AI that can do things in much more advanced and faster ways than determining whether it's seeing a duck. And also when we think about trust, there's a lot of things we do as human beings where we trust something that we don't understand, right? I mean, do you completely, before you board an airplane, understand how 80,000 to 176,000 pound plane can fly through the air? But
No.
we get on it all the time and fly. I fly all the time. I don't understand the aerodynamics and how that works at an intimate level, but I can trust it, right? I can trust it and use it. So I think there is a responsibility and an accountability to develop AI in a way that produces, and we're going to talk about some of the other influences like bias later, but to really make sure that we design things in a way that are ethical, that reduces bias, and that enhances the decision-making of the clinicians. I'll give one example. The number of medications that patients are on many times interact with each other. And that's a number one problem for ICU admissions, right? How many patients are admitted to the ICU because they're actually having reactions because they're on so many medications? One of the intensivists I work with called that polypharmacy disease. He made up a name for it, right? We deal with that. But a machine learning algorithm could take all of those interactions, could learn that information quickly, could learn the response of the patient, and maybe help guide us to not either add one more medication or maybe take a medication away or alter the dosage sooner rather than later. So there's things that I think we have to think about. How can we use these tools to make us faster, smarter, provide more timely and more safe care?
Absolutely. Dr. Patel, anything to add to that?
Yeah, this is I always get a kick out of this question because there's so much confusion around this, and a lot of people misinterpret automation for AI and vice versa. Even on the vendor side, I've seen companies say they have an AI tool when really all it is an automation tool. And just like Teresa said, I mean, AI is really about simulating human reasoning and for those very complex things. But the key differentiator is that AI learns, right? It learns from data. It adapts to data. It adapts to new situations. Automation is pre-programmed. We used automation a lot during COVID for symptom checking and decision trees to understand, where they need to go, get a test, not to get a test, you're doing fine, etc. And it could do it fast, and it can really help with a lot of the menial tasks and those repeated tasks that we do in healthcare over and over again. So it's really helping streamline those activities. But the other thing really what we need to understand about AI, there's a lot of subtypes of it, right? You've heard about ChatGPT. Well, that's a machine learning, right? That's large language model. So that's incorporated into AI. Natural language processing, which are used by various technologies that we use in the exam room to write our notes and different things like that. Computer vision, which you showed earlier as you kicked off this podcast, is exactly computer vision. We're starting to use some of that in radiology, robotics. So there's a lot of different subtypes of AI, and I think we have to just be very clear. Number one, not to start with the technology, but really clearly define that clinical need first and understand where AI can help us and where automation can help, and when there's a combination of both. Because really, you look at big data sets, you look at AI, then you look at RPA, right? There's different things that you need from AI and automation. But I think we have to be very clear about the problem we're trying to solve before we choose AI versus automation.
I think this question of what's the clinical problem you're trying to solve is always the question that I am driving home with every hospital institution that we work with. It's no matter what the change is, but this one even more so with the types of technologies that are coming down, to make sure that we're not just jumping to the next sort of shiny new object, to use a bad pun that we've used forever. But Aaron, I think this one goes right to you. How do we make sure that we're covering this ethically? How do we practically at the institutional level make sure that our organizations are utilizing artificial intelligence safely, and that the partnerships that they develop are ethical and also mutually beneficial, without causing any of the HIPAA violations that we all think about when we start to think about using data sets in developing AI.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just like to say I love a conversation where we are drilling down on defining AI and automation and the right use cases. I just keep my mouth shut and let the smarter people in the room define it appropriately. But it's actually a great segue into your question. I think we have to define the first question, as you, astutely pointed out. It's what are we trying to do here? What is the AI, and how's it going to help us? So often I get a phone call about, hey, tell me all the legal issues I have to worry about, when we're thinking about putting in this this AI solution. And my first question is like, okay, well, why are you putting it in? A lot of times it's, well, we want to reduce physician burnout, or well, we want to, remap or revamp our calendaring process and make it more efficient. And that's great. And it all goes back to that fundamental question is, why are you doing it? And then once you've identified the why, go to the people that it's going to impact, go to the physicians, go to the nurses, ask them if this is something they want to fix, if they need to fix it. So often the answer that comes back from that is not the answer that most technology departments in major facilities think they're going to get. I think that when you really boil it down to those two basic questions, making sure that you know what it is you're implementing and that the people that it's seeking to help will actually be helped, you can then kind of jump into those bigger picture questions that we've all been talking about here. That really it's what's your framework? Your framework, regardless of if AI or some other type of technology is in place, should be the same framework for all organizations. What is it that what tool are we trying to leverage? Number one, and how are we going to leverage it from the different pillars that we've been discussing here today? I heard accountability and evidence-based decision-making process. I heard a regulatory framework. Those are kind of all pillars of these frameworks that each organization should have in place, because if you sort of don't have that fundamental understanding of the regulatory framework, and I'll stay in my lane here, then you're going to miss the whole point, right? And so often I get a question from a vendor that is looking to help us negotiate an agreement with a large facility, and they say, okay, well, we need a ton of data. And, if our process or if our LLM is going to work, we need to ingest all the data in the EHR. And, I sort of think to myself, like, that's a huge task. That's a monumental task that you're going to be asking a hospital to undertake. And really and truthfully, most of the hospitals right now in the big facilities, they're looking for, pilots and proofs of concepts. And so, really that regulatory understanding of how data is going to move, how data is going to be shared is really key, in my opinion, when we talk about implementing these solutions. And so I always go back to, hey, what are you asking your client to provide you? Because we can build a lot of great products, but if we don't have the data to run it, really not going to go a long way.
And I think we've talked about this previously, Aaron, around this idea of who owns the data, right? And as we know, AI models do have to be refreshed over time. The model will degrade. And in order to be able to refresh, they need to have more data to be able to put that in. So how do institutions, without providing legal advice, so we'll put that caveat on here, we're not providing legal advice. How do we, as institutions, and I'm always about practical advice, make sure if we are in a relationship with a vendor of providing these refreshes around a deteriorating model, that we are in fact structuring our agreement such that we still own the data that we're providing, or that there's some kind of agreement. I know, Lisa May, you can speak to this maybe after Aaron, but there's a story of, them particularly losing data, and that's a difficult situation. Lots of setup there for that question, but I think you understand where I'm going there, Aaron.
Yeah. So, I mean, the sort of the gold standard in, especially when we're talking about hospitals, large healthcare providers, health systems, is HIPAA, right? And so from HIPAA doesn't really, from a legal perspective, doesn't discuss ownership. HIPAA doesn't say the covered entity owns PHI, but the covered entity does get to choose and really allow and choose how PHI is used by its vendors. And so if you're a software platform, an AI platform, an AI solution, you will most likely, if you're a vendor in the space, will most likely be a business associate of that facility, right? And so when you are a business associate, you take your direction and your uses and disclosures of PHI right from that business associate agreement. And we hear about, oh, we need to get a business associate agreement. We need to get a business associate agreement. Your business associate agreement is your roadmap, if you're a vendor, as to how you can and cannot use data. And on the sort of on the other side, if you are the healthcare provider, the hospital, the facility, the insurance company, if you're the covered entity, the business associate agreement is your, sort of your voice as to how your data can be used. Now, without getting too into the weeds, we can have different types of agreements that, allow for uses of PHI that perhaps are not more traditional. So we think about like licensing agreements or the use of de-identified data. The use of de-identified data is probably the single greatest aspect of HIPAA from an AI perspective. Technically, if a covered entity, a healthcare provider, wants to share their patient's data with a vendor, they don't need that patient's authorization to do that, right? But if they want to share that data for that vendor to use the data for whatever they want, then they actually do need that patient's written authorization. And so what ends up happening is that there's always kind of this surprise that occurs for startups, especially in the AI space. Well, what do you mean I can't own the data? And we have to tell them, well, we have to get in there and we have to talk about de-identified data, because the way to get ownership of data in this space is, especially in a HIPAA regulated world, is to utilize de-identified data. Now, not gonna say that that's an easy task when you're at the negotiating table and, telling the larger facilities that, hey, we need to own this de-identified data. But really, in a HIPAA regulated world, de-identified data is kind of the gold standard. It's the type of data that these AI companies will have to be built on, and really won't go down this rabbit hole, but federal privacy law should consider its impact. As we talk about a single federal privacy law that I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed. Here in the next maybe 5 years, it really should think about innovation and how it could impact, from a data ownership perspective. But yeah, it's de-identified data is sort of the gold standard at this point for vendors in the space to continue to build their models.
And these are foundational pieces that we really need to consider and keep in place and put in place as we start to use AI. But Teresa, what foundations have you found that organizations need to have in place in order to be able to have an effective use of AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things that we've seen come out of even like the World Health Organization has talked about data landscaping, in which you're really defining who all the players are within that data landscape. So foundationally, even if you're doing this at the organizational level, even before you introduce sharing data with vendors, is to really have that strong foundation of who are your data stewards going to be? Who are your data processors going to be? Who are the key stakeholders that need to have access to the data to learn from these data? Even before you start to think about how am I going to add an algorithm, a predictive algorithm or something else using an outside vendor, you need a very strong structure within your organization to determine that. It needs to be a multidisciplinary team. It can't just be data scientists and a handful of clinicians. It has to be the clinicians who actually document the data. So if you're going to make decisions on nursing data, nursing documented data, you need nurses at the table who have a very intimate understanding of how those data elements get into the electronic medical record. Because if you don't have them at the table, you could make a decision about a data element that's the wrong decision. You could make a decision around missingness. Maybe you think it's missing at random and it's not. Now, then we'd get into the bias discussion and how we introduce bias into these algorithms. So we have to think about that. Same with respiratory therapy, pharmacy. Whoever is managing that information most frequently and inputting that information in, they're going to understand the nuances of that. So it's really important to have a good data landscaping and data governance structure in place before you decide to do something with analyzing those data or partnering with someone who will analyze those data. And I think one of the biggest problems we're having also in this space is that meaningful use isn't as meaningful as it could be because we still haven't tackled the problem of interoperability. So we have these electronic health records that have made us better, right? There's many ways it's improved, but there's still not interoperability with good, strong, solid at the data element level interoperability. A lot of vendors will tell you they have interoperability and all they have is a PDF that goes back and forth, right? So we need to actually tackle the problem of true integration and solid interoperability before we can really have these algorithms be able to continue to learn and have less problems with them degrading as well. So again, there's so many variables that are associated with this, but having the right team, having good data, landscaping and good data governance is really important.
Yeah, there are so many factors here. And Dr. Patel, I know that you and your experience at Prisma and then your current experience, Prisma as the Chief Digital Officer and now at Hackensack, assisting them as well. What are your thoughts on foundation based on your experience? What foundational keys? Do you have anything that you would add to what Teresa had, or do you have a difference of opinion?
Yeah, just to build upon what Teresa said, I think that the number one thing to build your foundation on is data maturity. Your data has to be clean. Teresa mentioned this, right? So if you try to layer in artificial intelligence models on top of bad data, you're going to get bad interpretation. It's like no different than a teacher teaching a child the wrong way of doing math, right? And so this is where I think a lot of health systems struggle. Some health systems are very mature when it comes to their data maturity, and some are not. And if you look at some health systems, even the large ones like the Life Points out there, they're in disparate EHRs. They're not talking to each other. So if you're trying to make interpretation across the entire organization, that's different than looking at one instance of one EHR and that interpretation of what comes out of that data set. So I think before people start thinking about, this is what the advice I give to my clients, is to really look at how mature your data is, how interoperable they are, as Teresa's point is, right? We can't just look at EHR data. We got to look at claims data. We got to look at SDOH data, environmental data, regional data, right? The CDC map will tell you that the population in South Carolina is different than California, right? So again, we have to try to look at holistically the data set in order to make the interpretation. And outside of that, it's also a partnership. I mean, like some organizations partner with either Microsoft or Google, and they understand that their models are not 100% accurate. But, I think everyone's not expecting them to go from just taking over clinicians. And we've said this is just there to enhance and aid providers. We have to consider a lot of variables as doctors and nurses, right? A lot of things that are going through our mind when we talk to a patient. And if we can get those sort of insights and tidbits prior to, and maybe best next action suggestion, then those are the things that are going to help us move the needle. And so when I focus my SOWs and SLAs and these sort of things, I focus really more on what are those key needs and outputs that we're looking for. And again, I think to me, AI, again, as part of the definition, is a constant learning model. If we're going to emulate human intelligence is based on continuous learning. And so we have to make sure that the model is keeping up with the changes that occur. If a particular cancer, like breast cancer for a certain genotype, is a X treatment, and now there's a new treatment, we need to make sure that we are aware of that. We're also, I think this is a huge opportunity for us, for us to think outside of our own health systems and look at population health. Looking at populations of every single woman who's had breast cancer with a certain genotype, with a certain family background, with a certain makeup, that is now, this is the best outcome. This is a sequence of events that need to occur. Same thing with diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, everything else, right? We need to start to use AI to get us down to that precision medicine type level that we've been talking about for the last decade, combining various data sets so we can get better insight beyond just what's in front of us.
I couldn't agree more around the precision medicine element. And you're right, we've been talking about that for more than we should, longer than we should. And it would be great to be able to use these tools. And as we saw in the Gemini, video, that's the latest Google AI test. And like I said, that was kind of a fun, video to take a look at, but it demonstrates the limitations. And so, as you mentioned, it's assistive. And we know that the AMA has already defined that as assistive as well. This isn't a replacement for clinical care or for other clinical decision making. But it is important, this idea of the data being different. You pointed it out, Nick, that's people in South Carolina are different than people in California, and people in South Florida are different than people in North Florida in one state. And so when you think about, and Lisa may tell me a little bit about this idea of what I would call regionalizing this AI, or taking AI and utilizing, factors to be able to figure out, are we actually introducing bias, or should we make our vendors say, this model works, we've tested this model in South Florida, and we've tested this model or developed this model in your area, to Nick's point around all these factors of social determinants of health, environmental factors, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Dr. Patel did a very good job in outlining what factors create that data set that we're going to build these models, train these models on. and the generalizability of the AI models, it has its limitations. Not every organization can afford to partner or to develop their own AI infrastructure. And so they have to depend on what's already out there. But luckily, there is work being done on transferability of models. So you might have a nice clean data set, as mentioned earlier, where you have identified all of the factors that are relevant to a population. And, I'm here in South Florida, and I agree with you, it's completely different from North Florida. But if you have an AI model that has those transferability components, that identifies those biases, understands that there are knowledge limitations, going back to the explainability of AI, that these transferable operations can then be applied to different data sets. It's very easy for several models to be done on one data set, but the opposite is a little bit more challenging, where several data sets can't, with the same model, it has those challenges of introducing bias and those hallucinations. So really and truly, I'm really excited to see that all of these things that we're talking about, that there are experts out there very concerned with this. Researchers are looking into how we can do better when it comes to developing and training AI models. You did mention earlier about degradation of models. I just want to come back to that point, because it's very important that us as clinicians, nurses, providers, physicians, that we understand that it's not set it and forget it. We need to hold accountable the vendors to them, looking at the model degradation over time, the rate of that degradation, and the absolute errors that it's creating, and how many patients will it miss in order to give me one right result. So all of those things need to be understood by us on the receiving end of the AI, so that we can better take care of patients and understand how we can then move forward, that we don't become Skynet, right? So eventually, I think it will become, it is ubiquitous to a certain degree, but it will become more on the individual patient level, where they're going to expect some AI, but we have all of these challenges that are now presenting that we need to address, and thank goodness regulators and researchers are doing the lion's share to try to get us to where we can build more trust in these systems.
Absolutely. Teresa?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of build on this regulation aspect a little bit and talk about some of the cons associated with it. So we have very highly regulated vital sign monitoring, right? And so what we have found historically is that from a regulatory standpoint and also from a clinical standpoint, we seem to be okay with extremely sensitive and not very specific. So because we don't want to miss something, we're willing to accept high rates of notification that are meaningless. And what we're not thinking about is from a human behavioral standpoint. This is ingrained in us. This isn't chosen. We can become desensitized because something that continually alerts us that most of the time is meaningful or meaningless, we'll start to ignore. It's how we're designed from a human behavior standpoint. It's not intentional. And so then when someone ignores that alert, that best practice advisory, because it comes up so often and we don't need to take action, or it's at the wrong time in our workflow, or that alarm, bedside alarm that continuously goes off while I have other alarms that are higher priority or other alerts that are higher priority, I'm going to ignore those, because if I don't ignore those, I cannot complete the tasks that are in front of me that I need to do from a patient safety standpoint. So I'm trading one patient safety action with another one. And we put clinicians in that position all the time currently. So if we fall back on tightly regulated scenarios, we're going to have the same problem we have today with best practice advisories and alarms being highly sensitive and not very specific. And we're going to end up with an additional rate of fatigue with our healthcare providers and having to make these kinds of decisions. So I think we have to be careful with that. And when we think about bias, we have to think about the different types of bias, right? There's data-driven bias. So how we design the algorithm, for example, the dermatology ones where we classify skin lesions, but we've only done that on lighter skinned people. So we've introduced bias because now when we do the same algorithm on darker skinned people, it can't pick up that lesion. We know that Black patients are 3 times more likely to suffer us missing occult hypoxemia when we're using O2 saturation because we developed O2 saturation primarily on white people. Now, that wasn't done intentionally. Nobody said we're going to exclude studying this. It's just that white people tend to be more commonly part of research studies. So we have to make sure that when we design these things, we say, okay, this is the population we had to design it. Now we have to go test it on a different population. And so we have to do that with everything we design, from devices to AI and machine learning algorithms. And when we think about it from that input standpoint, right now our electronic health records have very poor granular data related to ethnicity and race. It's very high level. So again, in order to make the algorithm so that it's going to perform in different populations of patients, we need to ensure that we capture the granular characteristics that the model would need in order to have higher levels of precision.
Great point. Nick, you have something to add?
Yeah, I don't know if the folks on this podcast are aware, but at the last, I think it was the last HIMSS, there's a consortium of health systems that got together with AMCs, both non-academic and academic medical centers and industry partners, and formed a collaborative called Valid AI. And I have to read it so I can say it right here. So Valid AI stands for Vision, Alignment, Learning, Implementation, and Dissemination of Validated Generative AI in Healthcare. And it really is mainly to make sure that we have the ability of this group to help accelerate the safe adoption of Gen AI in healthcare. And I do think that organizations and groups like that and HIMSS and others will, I think, hopefully help us, give us some of that guidance. But it's just like when I look at a research study, right? I look at p-value, confidence interval. I look at different parts that's going to tell me, you know, number needed to treat, et cetera. We need something similar for AI that validates that something is accurate when it's saying it's accurate, and when it's not. And then just to Teresa's point on again, you know, we do not want to have AI increase the inequality gap in healthcare. And I think that just like when we look at study cohort and research, we can see that they standardized across a cohort of populations, and female, male, gender, race, all those things need to be considered as part of this. And I think there needs, again, regulatory and some standards need to be put in place. So when we can look at a tool, it is accurate. Because one thing we haven't touched on yet is the legal system is also looking at this very closely. And if we take an interpretation from an AI bot and we take action on it and it has a bad outcome, that health system is at risk, right? And especially if we didn't validate that tool to be accurate. It's almost like taking a non-licensed physician or nurse to provide care. And so I think we have to look at this very closely. I think we're just starting to cross first base on this. I think we've got a lot of work to do before, at least I personally, as a provider, will feel accurate or confident, I should say, in using it beyond just it helping us take care of patients.
Yeah, Nick or Aaron, exactly. Thank you for raising your hand. I was going to you next, so go for it.
Yeah, to Nick's point, and there may be others out there, but the Washington Medical Board has actually put out I guess maybe best practices in incorporating AI into a medical practice. And really, I can sum it up for you in a really short line, which is we encourage you to use AI, but you're on the hook for the decision that you make. And really, that's, I think, absent more education, absent more understanding of the uses and various abilities that AI will have, I think that's the regulatory framework that you're going to more or less see here coming out. And I think it was to Teresa's point, the world doesn't need more notifications. It needs, the right level of notification. It's always interesting to me, I see two things. I see a couple things in these contracts for these solutions now that sort of irk me, to the nth degree, which is you can customize your notifications, but you're going to get these 10. That's one I see quite a bit. And then the other one, and this is kind of to an earlier point in the conversation, which is you will not use our data to retrain your model. And that to me is like, well, why are we doing this? Because if we're not using your data to retrain this model, that means you're getting the same level of validness and accuracy and all those other buzzwords every single time for the duration of this agreement. And really, I think that's just doing a disservice. It's one of the principles that I see thrown around from a framework perspective is, return on investment and value. And you're not getting any return on your investment if you're not using your data to retrain an algorithm, whether it's homegrown or vendor based. It really behooves you to use that data to your advantage.
Absolutely. I know that we're at 2:47. I wanted to make sure that we got any questions from the audience. We did have one earlier, but to remind folks that are listening, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. The definition of process automation has been based on branch logic, but only because that's all that there has been. Generative AI can certainly identify new patterns and conduct new tasks and new automation. Any thoughts on that? Is that the question is around, isn't the definition, the earlier definition, outdated, really?
Yeah, and that was my definition. Yep. So thank you for bringing that up. I agree. I did try to provide some simplistic definitions for automation, but you're absolutely correct. We can now start to combine automation with some of these advanced algorithmic responses, using AI, machine learning, many of the other large language models, etc., to help enhance automation with some more decision making that is more human-like. So I agree that that is a rather rudimentary definition that I gave, but I was just trying to help the audience see the difference, that automation tends to follow defined rules, and we've been using automation for a long time in healthcare and in other industries.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as AI is the brain and automation's the hands. They're the doers, they're the outputs, right?
Absolutely. You're right. So another question that came up is AI makes me nervous is the first reaction when I get when I'm talking to stakeholders. Any thoughts about encouraging adoption in a traditional calling such as medicine, and which is very adverse to change and very conservative, typically, rightly so. And I'll pass that to you, Lisa May, and to you, Dr. Patel.
So AI makes me nervous too. I think about, and I mentioned it earlier, I think about Skynet, and I was also thinking about, if you're a Marvel fan, Age of Ultron. So you think that that's what AI is here to do, to take over, but really it's to, in healthcare especially, it cannot really replace a clinician's expertise, knowledge, and experience. AI would have to have that same knowledge and experience over time, I guess, to be equivalent. But even with the experiment we saw in the video earlier, that the human mind already quickly identified that it was a duck pretty early on. What we have a challenge with is explaining why and how we came to that decision, because it's automatic to us. It's how we view life. We walk through life and we make inferences and determinations all the time without thinking about it. So how we integrate AI into our clinical practices in our organizations is really up to us, right? It's up to the stakeholders to make that decision and take it in baby steps, really, as to and by answering what am I solving for and sticking to that plan makes you in the driver's seat. You're in control of how you incorporate AI into your practice, your organization, and so forth. So yes, it does make us nervous, and rightly so, because then we will ensure that the integrity of the information, the data, and also the output. And that's a good, healthy position to be in.
Any thoughts, Dr. Patel, on how to encourage adoption or to encourage an organization that might not want to get into this?
Yeah, I think again, all new technologies should be looked at very carefully and closely. All fundamental major developments in the humankind have, been dramatic, right? When they first come out. I mean, I saw the movie Oppenheimer, and when the atomic bomb was invented, you can imagine the fear that people had that we would destroy ourselves. But at the same time, we have to think through how these technologies can be used for good. I mean, there are a lot of things that I think it can be used for. I think, again, going back to the starting Gemini piece, we're looking at use of AI for computer vision to accelerate interpretation of radiological images, right? Siemens is doing it, Philips is doing it, not to actually make the diagnosis, but if if a radiologist in the ER is sitting there, everything that comes to that radiologist is stat. So the image number 20 and he's reading number 1 may be positive, but everything in between may be negative. If the AI can say, hey, there may be something in number 20, patient number 20, let's move that up into triage. So now I can read that. So, oh, actually, yeah, there looks like to be a pulmonary embolism there. So you're getting time to treatment done faster. I think it's going to help with clinical trial acceleration. They're already starting to use that. Pharmacy redesign, rare disease investigations and treatments, risk score adjustments for value-based care programs. So there's a lot of things it can be used for, but with everything in life, I think you have to be cautious and be careful. And you've seen a lot of White House sort of meetings around this when Elon Musk and Satya and others from Microsoft, because the fears around sentient intelligence, right? I don't think we're there. God knows, maybe somewhere in some lab somewhere there is a Terminator waiting. But I'm going to be the glass half full person and say that we can probably use this to really accelerate humankind and more importantly, accelerate in how we improve outcomes in America for healthcare and around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's use the tool for what it's intended and not spin off into conspiracy theories, etc. One of the questions that we have here, and I know we're waiting on time, so I want to make sure that we catch as many of these as we can. We may not be able to answer all of them that are in the chat here, but we'll try as much as we can. One quick question was around recommending, sounds like you're recommending that all hospitals should be involved in population health, a place where using AI could provide benefit. Is that I see a nods all around on that one. So yeah, I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. And then do you think that we should rebrand that it's not AI? Maybe things we labeled intelligent are only language learning. Should we rename AI? Anybody have any thoughts on that one?
I think it's a good point. Like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of subfields like LLMs and machine learning and natural language processing and etc. List goes on and on. I think, again, just like the brain has multiple parts to it, AI has multiple parts to it. And so I don't know if it requires like a retitle or redefinition, but I just think we need to have awareness that there are various components that make AI work.
And Aaron, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think so. From a legal perspective, I can tell you that, one thing that I've started to see in agreements with growing frequency has been, addendums, sort of AI addendums, right? And it's asking you point blank, are you using artificial intelligence to process, our data? And that's, a yes, no question. If yes, then, I've seen, further questions or reps and warranties within those agreements. And so, rebranding, it's above my pay grade, but I will tell you that, from a contractual perspective, you're now, if you are saying that you are using AI, some of your contractual partners may ask you to represent and warrant that you are. And if you are, usually that leads you down the road of how can you prove it's all of the things that we've been discussing today: ethical, regulatorily sound, those types of concepts. And so, whether or not you rebrand is up to you, but you could be asked to answer the question point blank.
Really good point. Time to put up or shut up there, really, to put it plainly, right? Last but not least, just a quick round robin on everything that's happening in healthcare, artificial intelligence, in the way that we're seeing a ton of innovation. I think this year we're seeing an explosion of lots of different things around virtual care. We could all name something. And so what is that next big thing from your perspective, and your thoughts around that? It doesn't necessarily have to be healthcare, but it would be good to keep it in that topic. Teresa, you're on my top left, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I think my key take home I want to make here is that we can't be so afraid of innovation in AI that we continue to keep doing things the way we're doing things. Because the way we're doing things, we're still having a jumbo jet crash every day of patients because of harm that we do, not intentionally. It just happens because we don't have processes and we're not using innovation and technology to its full potential to help us be smarter and safer in the care that we provide. And it's only going to get worse because we now are looking at shortages of healthcare providers, which means we're going to have lack of expertise at the bedside.
Absolutely. Lisa May, you're next on my list.
Well, not necessarily with healthcare directly, but indirectly. I've seen a lot of articles and discussions around merging AI and robotics and allowing the robots themselves to be to multitask. Right now, they're kind of single task oriented, but being able to multitask and test their own models by trial and error. So that I thought was interesting. And healthcare, we've been using robotics for many, many years, but I don't know how ready we are for AI robotic surgery, for example. But to be able to guide a surgeon in identifying something in the visual field that might not be he might not see or she might not see, but allowing them to change course or course correct during surgery, and understanding that, these tools again, and I know I sound like a broken record, again, are to help support what we're already doing. And as Teresa rightly said, to keep patients safe. And so I thought that was the most interesting thing I saw, that merging with the robotics. Would be interested to see how that is incorporated in our healthcare.
Who knows what that's going to look like in the future? And Nick, what are your thoughts on the next big thing?
Got a lot of sci-fi books to my right here, so it take a long time, but I think there's a lot from ingestibles to wearables to things in the house that are going to help us stay safe and give us early detection. But I think the biggest thing is taking all the things we talked about, AI, RPA, et cetera, looking at big data around our genetics and understanding when people are going to get cancer before they get cancer, and targeting cancer cells based on, again, the genetics of that patient individually. I think there's just I think the next big thing is really the combination of what we already have. And right now they're all kind of separate swim lanes, but when they intersect in the right way, that's going to be fundamentally change how we deliver care in this country.
Amen. I'd love to see that. Aaron, last but not least.
I love the genetics spin and the precision medicine aspect of this, but I'll go with what I'm most excited to see is patient engagement, patient comfort with AI. Right? You sort of see these the chatbots, the interactive solutions that are starting to be able to sense tenseness or trepidation in a patient's voice or some sort of emotional feeling that it can actually pick up on based on the tone of the voice. I think aspects like that allow patient engagement are going to lead to greater patient education, which will eventually lead to comfort with AI, right? We've talked about being scared of AI and what it can do, but if people can actually see the good it can produce, I think it'll go a long way to sort of soothing those fears.
Absolutely. I'll take my last but not least on me, and that is most excited about Gen Alpha as we see those kids that are now growing up. These are children that will never know a life without a screen, never know a life without technology, and what will they create in the future? I can't wait to see that. Thank you so much to the panel. This was an amazing discussion. I'm so much smarter after today. Thank you. Thank you, everybody who attended. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on these webinars, we always try to cover interesting and timely topics for everyone throughout the year. Next month, I think we have a lightning webinar. Those are our quick 15-minute topics. So if you have anything like that, just let us know. Put that in the messages post a webinar. All of our webinars are recorded, and you can access them on our website at blue-cirrus.com. Thanks again to everybody. Have a good rest of the week.